Hey guys, and thanks for listening to this episode of the Campus Safety Voices podcast. I'm Amy Rock, Senior Editor for Campus Safety, and today's episode will cover human trafficking and how it can present itself on college campuses. I spoke to Maraya Lasinsky, who is the Chief Advisor for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and who also for the past 2 years has worked on the Blue Campaign, which is a national public awareness campaign designed to educate the public, law enforcement, and a variety of industry partners on how to recognize the indicators of human trafficking and how to respond. While working to identify gaps within the campaign's portfolio, Maraya discovered there was a significant need for access to human trafficking training for campus law enforcement. Through her research and speaking to campus law enforcement officers about their needs, the Campus Law Enforcement Recognition and Response Guide was created. Maraya and I discussed this guide and more, including the different types of human trafficking, what they look like and their prevalence, what makes college students more vulnerable to human trafficking, who the perpetrators often are in relation to the victims, common indicators of human trafficking that campus law enforcement should be on the lookout for, additional resources and training that is available for campus law enforcement, and much more. Take a listen. Be sure to subscribe to Campus Safety's YouTube channel and like or leave a comment on our videos. Or subscribe to our Campus Safety Voices podcast on Apple and Spotify and leave a review. We can just start off by telling us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you do at the Department of Homeland Security.
Yeah, sure. So I have been at the Department of Homeland Security for about 13 years now. I have about 16 years of experience either working or volunteering in human trafficking training and awareness. As far as the Blue Campaign goes, I have been on the campaign for about 2 years, a little over 2 years at this point.
And do you want to just give an overview of the Blue Campaign and what it is and what it does?
Yeah, sure. For the Blue Campaign, we are a national public awareness campaign, and we are located at the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, because I will probably slip that acronym in at some point. So at DHS headquarters, under the Office of Partnership and Engagement. And so before I tell you a little bit about the campaign, I always like to give the disclaimer of, so DHS is a law enforcement branch of the government, and that's how most people recognize it. But for us at the Blue Campaign, even though we are located at Homeland Security, we're not law enforcement. So we don't work directly with victims or on live cases. We work very closely with law enforcement, and I'll tell you, a little bit more about that later. But our focus at the Blue Campaign is really on that public awareness piece. So we were set up really to educate the public, to educate law enforcement, and then to educate a variety of industry partners on how to recognize the indicators of trafficking, and then how they can appropriately report or respond to possible cases. And so for us at the Blue Campaign, we're really about training and education of all these different audiences, our different partners, and we focus a lot on educational materials. And so I'll tell you a little bit more about that later, but we focus a lot of our time and attention on trainings, presentations, posters. We have a pretty robust resource library, and everything we do at the Blue Campaign is free of charge. And so we work with a variety of partners and stakeholders on our materials, but we also loop in survivors on everything we do at the Blue Campaign. So we are at the Department of Homeland Security. We are not law enforcement, but we focus really heavily on the training and education piece of human trafficking awareness.
Okay, it's interesting that you say training law enforcement too, because I think in a lot of people's minds, they think like law enforcement has to be experts on all these topics, but like that would obviously just be so overwhelming and a lot for them to take on. So they basically have experts in the back helping get them the important information that they need to be helpful.
Absolutely.
Cool. And so people think human trafficking, and I feel like most people think of it as, for sexual purposes as the most common occurrence. And what other types of human trafficking are there that may be less known?
Yeah, that is a great question. And when we do presentations, we focus quite a bit on this topic, because I think one of the big myths or misconceptions about human trafficking is that it's just sex trafficking. And like you said, I think that's the most well known. And I think there's been a big spotlight on sex trafficking. A lot of films or documentaries seem to focus on sex trafficking, and that is definitely one of the types. But a form of human trafficking that I think is less known is labor trafficking. Labor trafficking also affects men and women and children. There's elements of force, fraud, and coercion going on for labor trafficking. Similarly, if you had a sex trafficking case. And then within labor trafficking, you can have a variety of different industries or businesses that can be complicit in labor trafficking. So one of the specific forms of labor trafficking that I don't think a lot of people are aware of is domestic servitude. Domestic servitude is a type of labor trafficking, and it usually involves somebody bringing a person into their house. So it could be under, the number that they're going to work as a nanny or a housekeeper or a maid. So you're inviting them into your personal home. And then what oftentimes happens is that person is not allowed to leave. Any sort of legal documentation is taken away from them. They're usually made to work 24/7. We've seen cases where they have to sleep on a floor. Food can often be used as a reward or a punishment. So if you did good today, you get to eat. If you messed up, you didn't clean something well enough, then you're not eating for today. And so for domestic servitude, we've seen this happen here in the United States. We've seen a couple cases where we've had diplomats who live here from other countries, and they'll bring somebody over from their home country. And then essentially lock them in, take their documents away from them. So that's a specific form of labor trafficking that I don't think a lot of people are aware of that happen here. But labor trafficking, as I mentioned, happens in a variety of industries. So I think people have heard of nail salons or massage parlors have gotten some press about labor trafficking, but it can also happen in the construction industry. It can happen in agriculture, on farms, in fields. It can also happen in the restaurant industry. And we've heard from survivors where restaurants, especially like buffet restaurants, where you're having to cook large quantities of food over and over again throughout the day, that requires a lot of manpower. So we've heard from survivors who have been labor trafficked in restaurants. So it really happens, sadly, in a variety of industries. And at the Blue Campaign, something we're really focusing on in 2022 is sort of expanding our training and our materials to talk more about labor trafficking and forced labor and what that looks like.
And we were saying, oftentimes, like with other types of abuse, whether it's domestic abuse or sexual abuse or anything like that, victims often know their abusers. And this could be applied, I'm sure, to sex trafficking or labor trafficking. Is this the case for human trafficking? And what are some common types of relationships between a human trafficking victim and their abuser?
Yeah, you are absolutely right. Very similar to some of those crimes you just mentioned. Oftentimes, victims of human trafficking, whether sex or labor, know their trafficker ahead of time. And so it's not to say there aren't unique situations where somebody could be, a stranger, they meet a stranger and they take them, or they're kidnapped. So not saying that doesn't happen in unique situations, but I like to try to get people away from this whole myth of, somebody's, looking at you in the Walmart parking lot or in the Target parking lot or casing you. And oftentimes that's just not the case. So when it comes to trafficking, the trafficker could be a romantic partner to that victim. That could be a boyfriend or a girlfriend. So traffickers can also be women. And so that trafficker could act as a romantic partner, filling that void of a relationship. For labor trafficking, that trafficker could be their employer or a current employer that's trying to lure them in with these, really great promises of a better life or better wages. But traffickers could also be family members. And I think people are really surprised to hear that you can have somebody in your own family, or in certain situations, we've seen where the parent acts as a trafficker for their children. It could be friends. And we've seen this sort of in our younger victims, where they get lured into a trafficking situation through another friend. And it could be even people of prominence within their own community who could be a trafficker. I think when everything broke about Jeffrey Epstein, people were very surprised, to hear or see somebody of his level of wealth who was operating, in this trafficking ring. So it could be a variety of people to the victim.
Okay. And now, are there certain populations that are more vulnerable to human trafficking?
So we know that human trafficking, whether sex or labor, can really happen to anybody. The way I always put it is, there's not really one face of a victim, but there are certain vulnerabilities that could really make somebody more susceptible to trafficking than someone else. And so just to sort of give you a high level overview, some of those vulnerabilities could be if there's a potential language barrier, if that victim lacks stable housing, or even lacks access to like food or shelter, like very basic needs. If there is a lack of a social support network or strong family networks around them. Because we know traffickers, they're looking for hardships. They're looking for your vulnerability. They're looking to see what you need, and then they're going to try to jump in and fill that need for you. So whether, it's jumping in, hey, I know a way that you can pay off your debt, or, if it's that emotional need of you're looking, for a romantic partner or a relationship, they're going to look for ways to exploit you. And so it's really about the vulnerabilities that somebody, could exhibit that they're going to prey on.
Okay. And I like when you were talking about, you gave an example about domestic servitude and like someone who is not allowed to leave the house. I think when a lot of people envision human trafficking, they picture that someone being kidnapped and forced to live in captivity of some sort, but it seems like that isn't usually the case. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. So domestic servitude is probably some of the rare cases where somebody is physically restrained. And that is usually not the case when it comes to trafficking. And there's a couple reasons why. I think that there's this myth or misconception. If you've seen some human trafficking awareness posters or things like that, oftentimes you'll see somebody in chains, like their hands will be chained or their ankles will be chained, or they're behind prison bars almost. And so I think that's what people think of for you to be a trafficking victim. You're physically being restrained. But as we've talked about, oftentimes, the victim knows their trafficker. So if you think of the situation where that trafficker is the boyfriend or girlfriend, that's not their trafficker. That's their boyfriend. That's the person that says, I love you. And so because of that, these false promises of love, that victim could not even identify as a victim. So they don't know what's going on. They don't know that they're in a trafficking situation, or that the trafficker's psychological control is so strong, they don't need to physically restrain the victim. So, when we talk about trafficking, we'll talk a lot about force, fraud, and coercion that's going on. And so there's usually threats that are being made against that victim. Okay, if you go ahead and leave, here's what I'm going to do to you. Also, if that victim has kids or loved ones or family members, often the trafficker will target those kids or the family members and use threats against them as well. So especially for somebody who does have young kids, we've seen cases where the trafficker will show the person, oh, is this where your son waits for the bus every day? And they'll show the picture of the bus stop, or they'll show the soccer field where their kids practice every day. So go ahead and leave. And then I'm going to go find your kid. And now I'm going to do to your kid what I did to you. Or if the victim happens to be from another country, they will often have somebody back home take a picture of their family's house. Just to reiterate the point, go ahead and leave, but I know where your family lives or where your loved ones live. We've also seen other situations where the trafficker could blackmail their victim. We've seen this in our younger victims. And again, if we're thinking they're thinking they're in a relationship, they're online dating with this person, they may send provocative photos or naked pictures of themselves, because again, this is their boyfriend, right? Or their girlfriend. And then the trafficker will later use that against them, like, go ahead and leave, and I'm going to release these photos online, or, I'm going to send them to your parents. So all that to say, traffickers don't really need to kidnap their victim or to physically restrain them, because they have all these other less obvious ways that they can control their victim and keep them from leaving.
Okay. And obviously campus safety is geared towards, schools and colleges and hospitals. And so the main topic of our conversation will be human trafficking as it relates to college campuses. So how did Blue Campaign determine that, college and university campus police needed human trafficking information, and how do they collaborate with them? Can you share how we can talk about the toolkit too, and how that came to fruition?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing we do with the Blue Campaign every year, no matter who our audience is, so I mainly work with law enforcement and cover the law enforcement portfolio, is we try to identify gaps within our portfolio or within, for me, the law enforcement community. So who in law enforcement could potentially come across a trafficking victim or a trafficking situation, but they don't have a lot of access to training, or they haven't really been trained yet. So for campus law enforcement, I worked with our Office of State and Local Law Enforcement at DHS. And so I went to our local office to say, hey, who are you hearing from in the field? Because they have weekly calls with law enforcement out in the field. And so I worked with them to find out, who are you hearing from that could use human trafficking training, but they just don't have access to it, or maybe they don't have a budget for it. And so that's how I found out about campus law enforcement. And I was put in touch with the International Association of Campus Law Enforcement Administrators, or IACLEA, to sort of get the ball rolling in this arena, and worked with the training director there, who was very eager and excited to work with us. He was aware of trafficking happening on college campuses. And on the Blue Campaign side, we also worked with our own law enforcement partners. So at Homeland Security Investigations, or HSI, that's the arm of Homeland Security that investigates human trafficking cases. And we had heard from them that trafficking was happening on college campuses. And we went with some of our other law enforcement partners who had backed up and said, yep, we're seeing this on college campus. So all that to say, we sort of had built this gap to say, hey, we know what's happening. What can we do to help? What can we do to train campus law enforcement? And so with working through our law enforcement partners, stakeholders, we created the campus law enforcement recognition and response guide that sort of walks through what it can look like on a campus, how students can become susceptible to trafficking, what to do if they encounter a student, and then tips for what campus law enforcement can do, to sort of build a relationship with somebody who may be in a trafficking situation. And then after we had a draft of the guide done, we also loop in, as I mentioned earlier, we always have survivors participate and weigh in on our products. So we also work with survivors who had experienced trafficking in a campus, or as they were students in their background, to make sure what we were saying was realistic and applicable. And so for that recognition and response guide, one thing I want to point out is that it's geared for sworn and non-sworn law enforcement. So that was something we had also heard from IACLEA, is that a lot of their campus law enforcement or public safety officials were not sworn, and that impacts their ability to access, certain resources, certain trainings. And so for Blue Campaign, that also allowed us to fill that training gap, because anybody is welcome to use our resources.
I imagine a lot of the schools that you go to speak to campus police, that a lot of them are shocked and like don't realize that that was a problem. Do you find that?
Yep. And so so campus law enforcement's exciting for us because it's a new audience. And so as we're getting out there, we'll hear, a lot of like, I've heard of human trafficking, but I wouldn't think it would happen here. Or they don't know a lot about it. And so, but one of the really good things is everybody's very eager to learn and to get trained on it. You don't really need to convince campus law enforcement that there's a need to understand and to take this training.
Mm-hmm. And why are college students sometimes targets of human trafficking? What like can make them more vulnerable?
So we have quite a list in the recognition and response guide on this, but to give you and your viewers just sort of an idea, for many students going off to college, this is their first time living away from home, and they might not know anybody. So right off the bat, you could have that issue of lack of social networks, right? If they don't have a friend network already in place. There's also the potential opportunity for a trafficker to exploit students financially. And this is a big one we heard a lot from our law enforcement investigators who had worked trafficking cases on campus. So we know college is not cheap. You're usually starting out, right, with student loans or student loan debt. So right off the bat, that's an easy way for a trafficker to potentially target a student who's already experiencing financial hardship. And another way that can play out is we heard quite a bit about traffickers who would get the victim to open up a credit card, and the victim would open up that credit card in their name, in the victim's name. And then that trafficker helps them run up that credit card bill. And then all of a sudden, here again, you have a student who finds themselves in debt. They don't know how they're going to pay this off. And then the trafficker can jump in with a solution of, oh, well, I have some ideas on how you can pay that bill off. And just to reiterate, that was very much highlighted by our investigators of cases that they worked. That was something they saw fairly consistently, of how the trafficker would lure a student into a trafficking situation. But we also know, if there's any substance abuse or alcohol dependency going on, and that could be maybe the student already has an addiction or something going on, or it could be a way for the trafficker to exploit them, to get them hooked. So we know another way traffickers can keep somebody in a life is if there already isn't a dependency, they'll get them hooked, whether it's drugs or alcohol, because then it becomes much easier to sort of keep you in the life. And then someone's immigration status. We're also seeing cases where their immigration status can be exploited by a trafficker.
Now, and I don't know if you can share this, but in a lot of those instances where investigators are finding, the type of exploiting that's going on, are they typically someone known to these people too? Like someone that they met at a party? Or are they finding that they're other college students? Or
usually it's funny that you mentioned that, because that's what we've heard from our investigators. It's usually somebody a little bit older who's hanging out at parties, whether it's on campus or off campus, who, is a bit older, a bit more mature. They usually have a fancy car. They usually will offer to buy you things, and sort of that grooming process of getting you into. So more so than forcing somebody to open up a credit card, it's sort of this grooming process that takes, time or months, but it's oftentimes somebody that they meet, at a party on campus, friend of a friend.
Got it. Okay. And are there any parts of the country where human trafficking is more common? Whether in a college setting or not in a college setting? Sorry.
No, not at all. It's a great question. It's a question that we get quite frequently, no matter, who our audience is. So what we can tell you about human trafficking is that we know it happens in all 50 states, and we know that it happens in rural areas, because again, if you think of labor trafficking on farms and in fields, And we know it happens in big cities and it happens everywhere in between. And we also know that human trafficking is a crime that is severely underreported. And I think people may have a better understanding, as we've been discussing, maybe some of the reasons why it's such an underreported crime. But when we're asked about sort of where is it happening, what I really like to recommend for people is to check out this National Human Trafficking Hotline website. It's nationalhumantraffickinghotline.org. And even if you don't remember any of that and you just Google, human trafficking hotline, that is run by a nonprofit or an NGO called Polaris, and they're located here in DC. And what they do is they collect all the call data from around the country where people are calling in, and that could be victims calling in to report potential trafficking or seeking services. So I mentioned this website because they actually have a heat map, and it shows where they're getting the largest volume of call data from around the country. And so people can go, if there's a specific state you're interested in, like you're from Massachusetts, you can go onto this National Human Trafficking Hotline website, and they will break down the statistics by state. And so you can sort of see for your state, and then you can even break it down sometimes by city, and it will show you the call data that's coming in for those areas. And so I think that's a really good resource for people because I wish I could give you statistics off the top of my head where it's happening, but because it's so underreported, that for the government, we actually use the call data from this website, pretty frequently when we're looking at patterns and what's going on in the country. So I think that's a really good resource for people to check out.
And now I'm sure that this is outlined in the toolkit, in kind of maybe some cliff notes. What kinds of common indicators of human trafficking can campus law enforcement be on the lookout for?
Sure. So one of the reasons we really like working with campus law enforcement is that we know, oftentimes they can develop relationships with students that they see on campus. And so one indicator that campus law enforcement could potentially realize or recognize is if this is a student that they see on a regular basis, or they have a friendly relationship with, if that student is somebody maybe who's very friendly or bubbly, and then all of a sudden they're very angry, they're lashing out, because we'll see where there's a sudden behavior change, in a victim. Or does this student, who's usually a pretty good student, they make all their classes, suddenly you're seeing them hang out, during class time when they should be in the classroom. We also know a number of students work. They have work permits. Are they working outside of normal work hours for a student? Another one could be, are they dating somebody who is noticeably older? And again, that could be male and female. Or does that student suddenly have more expensive material goods or items that they never really had or carried before? So we know that campus law enforcement, can't be the only eyes and ears of potential trafficking, but I think they're in a great position because they can engage, other campus community leaders and administrators, on the crime, and just encourage these groups and students. Hey, if you see something off, or your roommate's acting weird, or they're not themselves, that they're a trusted place. Campus law enforcement, they're a trusted person. This is a trusted place that they can come to and talk and get help.
And talking about the guide as well, it highlights the importance of victim-centered approach, which they, reiterate with colleges too when they're interviewing students who, have been victims of sexual assault as well. So could you just elaborate on that a bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's really the big thing that we train on at the Blue Campaign when we're talking to law enforcement specifically. And it doesn't matter if it's campus law enforcement, state, local law enforcement, is this victim-centered approach, or sometimes called a trauma-centered approach. And we worked very closely with our Homeland Security investigation agents and our victim assistance specialists when we were putting, this approach together and developing this approach. And really what it means is that law enforcement puts just as much emphasis on getting that victim stabilized that they would on the investigation and prosecution of the crime, right? So that's sort of it in its simplest form. And we really want law enforcement to get that victim any services that they may need. That means giving the victim time to work through their trauma. And that's regardless if they participate in your investigation or in the prosecution of the crime. So you should be working to get them anything and everything they need to get them out of that situation, to get them the help they need, to get them stabilized. Whether or not they're going to answer your questions, whether or not they're going to participate in the investigation, because what we don't want to happen is for law enforcement to re-traumatize that victim by questioning them before they've even had time to seek help. So really, it's about starting to build a trusting relationship with the victim. So if you can start that from day one, which is like, hey, you don't have to answer any of my questions. What kind of help do you need? Let me get you in contact with victim services. You know, you're going to have a better chance of becoming that trusted person that then maybe they'll feel comfortable answering your questions down the road or participating, as opposed to sort of coming in right from the beginning and trying to pull them in, because we've seen that approach doesn't work.
Right. And you had said before that you oversee the training for officers, and obviously this is a loaded question and I'll have limited time, but can you elaborate a bit on the offerings and kind of like what that looks like?
As you mentioned, law enforcement is often overworked and all the hours. So we wanted to take that recognition and response guide and create an online tool that they can access 24/7. It accompanies the guide, gives them a high-level overview of the indicators. We also have a new training course called Concern that will be coming out later this year. And that will give law enforcement an opportunity to go through scenarios where they have to pick out the indicators of trafficking. One thing we always offer at the Blue Campaign is we do tailored or customized training or presentations to the audience. So if there's something specific, your law enforcement group wants training in, we can do that. And if it's something that's outside of our scope, like maybe investigation techniques or interviewing techniques, we can often loop in fellow stakeholders from Homeland Security. Like we can get an agent to jump on the training, or we can get a victim assistance specialist to jump on. And that's, again, always free. Webinars, presentations, trainings, mostly everything we do now is virtual, hoping to get back to in person, but we also have a monthly newsletter, social media. So there's multiple ways, that we can sort of jump in and help and provide resources, but we're always willing to do tailored trainings and presentations for anything they may need. And then something else, Amy, that might, that you mentioned that I think would be interesting is we just shot 2 live action videos and they will be ready in March, and they're for the general public. So anybody, students can take it, campus law enforcement, school administrators, and it's a sex trafficking scenario and a labor trafficking scenario. And they're both based on real stories. We had survivors on set for both of the filmings, and we essentially told their story. So the sex trafficking was about a woman who was trafficked through hotels, very nice hotels, not skeezy motels, which is what most people think happens, in sex trafficking. And we told her story of what it looked like when she was trafficked through hotels. And then for the labor trafficking, it was showing 3 men flipping a house, doing construction on a house. And we had a survivor on set, and this was her son's experience and her experience. And then we asked the audience, we take the audience through the indicators, and would you recognize this? Because both situations were things you could see in your regular life, that you could see, on vacation or down the street.
Obviously, it's important for law enforcement to recognize the signs as well, but for students, do you have any tips how to avoid types of situations that sometimes lead to human trafficking? And also any recommendations on what they should do if they're a victim? I know you had said that there's that hotline that people can call.
So one of the things I always like to point out, especially to our high school and college students, is, this is going to sound simple, I know, but it's be careful, be wary of who you're letting into your life, especially on social media, because we know, especially in this COVID environment, that's how a lot of traffickers are reaching out, and they're looking at what you're posting on social media. Did you have a bad day? You didn't get into a certain college, you didn't get into a class, you're fighting with a friend. Something that seems very minor like that are all little things that they can prey on to start a conversation with you. If somebody, says, I love you too quickly, they're willing to buy you all these expensive things right off the bat. If somebody's offering you a really good job in a field that is very hard to get into. So we've seen cases where a trafficker will offer, hey, I can get you into modeling. If you just want to send me some pictures, I know somebody, I can get you into this modeling agency, or I can get you into acting. If you want to take some video for me, I can get you, this really great acting job. So it's, if it's something's too good to be true, it probably is. And we know that's what traffickers are trying to offer. So we know, again, they're looking for these vulnerabilities that you're putting out there. And if you are somebody that is a victim, or you're a student and you have a friend, your roommate, you're suspecting something's going on, something's off, go to your campus law enforcement. You can also report the crime of human trafficking. The Homeland Security investigation tip line is always an option. That number is 1-866-347-2423. And that will go to the closest Homeland Security investigation office where your campus or where you're calling from is located. And that will go to an agent to see and investigate what's going on with that tip. So you can call that number anonymously, or you can give your information if you do want to give more details. But that's one way you could report the potential crime of trafficking. And there's no consequence if you call that number and you're like, hey, I think I'm seeing this on my campus, or I think, I see somebody who could be trafficking my friend. Again, 24/7, you can call it anonymously. There's no repercussions or backlash. If that tip is investigated and it's proven to not be trafficking, we always want you to report. And as you mentioned, there's always that National Human Trafficking Hotline. And so that phone number is 1-888-373-7888. And victims can call that number as well. And that's where you can reach out for victim services, no matter where you are in the United States. So I also like to give this phone number to law enforcement as well, especially if you're somebody, your local law enforcement, you're in a tiny town, and you're not sure, is there a victim assistance specialist nearby? Or, you can call this number 24/7 and they will link you to emergency services that are the closest to your area. And the same thing, you can call this number anonymously. And there's never any consequence or backlash. So the main thing is, if you're suspecting something's going on, something's wrong, make a call, make a phone call.
And we are obviously focusing on college and university law enforcement with the Blue Campaign, but does the Blue Campaign offer any resources for K through 12 school resource officers as well? Because obviously it's something, human trafficking doesn't only impact, 18 and up, a college student.
Right. No, very true. And so incredibly sad that, we need additional resources to target the K through 12 grade. So what we have right now is a how to talk to youth guide that's on our website. Now that was really created for adults who work with kids after school. So think of like a boys and girls club, because we found, again, there was a gap. They're not teachers, they're not counselors. We found there was a gap with this adult population who were interacting with youth that could be vulnerable to trafficking. And so it goes again into like the indicators of that age group of K through 12, the indicators, how to talk to them, how to approach them, how to get them help. And so that's something we have on the books right now that you can download directly from our website. But as going forward, I'm actually working on a recognition and response guide for school resource officers specifically for that K through 12 grade. So it's something similar to what you've seen with that campus law enforcement guide, we are currently in the middle of creating for those school resource officers. But as I'm sure you're aware, it can be different indicators. So we always loop in our, law enforcement stakeholders. And so we're currently in that process, and that guide will be released. That should be done in October of this year. So that should be a new resource that comes out for the next fiscal year. So that one's in the process. But if somebody's looking for a guide or tools or tips right now on talking to youth, I think that How to Talk to Youth recognition guide is a really good resource.